Good morning, everyone. My name is Amit Baran, and I would be your host for today. On behalf of IDI, we are very pleased and excited to welcome you to our sixth global event. We would also like to thank you all for joining us today and wanted to wish you a wonderful academic year. Today, we are pleased to host Mr. Gustav Gressel of the European Council of Foreign Relations. Mr. Gressel is a senior policy fellow at the European Council, holds a PhD in strategic studies at the Faculty of Military Sciences. He is the author of numerous publications regarding security policy and strategic affairs, and a frequent commentator on international affairs. His areas of expertise are Eastern Europe, Russia, armed conflict and military affairs, defense policy, and missile defense. Mr. Gressel is here today to share his expertise, insights, and unique understanding on the topic of Russian defense and military policies in the Middle East. Before we get started, I would like to welcome Mr. Tal Zellinger, IDI's founder and president, to share his opening statement and a warm message to all our global chapters. Tal, the stage is yours.
Dear all, thank you for attending our global event. I'm just as excited as you are to hear from Mr. Gustav Gressel. IDI is continuing to raise the bar by bringing the best global perspectives in foreign affairs to you. I hope to see you all during our next event and become involved in our local chapters around the world. Please visit our website and learn more and become a member if you have not already. Thank you.
So it's my turn now.
Yeah.
So good morning, everybody. I'm quite pleased and excited to give you some short thoughts about Russia's military posture in the Middle East and its policies and where we're all heading towards. As you have heard, I'm a specialist on Russia and military affairs working in the European Council on Foreign Relations. So my military background, I actually grew up in Austria and was a military officer in the Austrian Armed Forces and later the Ministry of Defense. And I worked a lot during that time actually with Ukraine. In 2014, ECFR was looking for somebody who knew the Ukrainian armed forces a bit better than the usual stuff and who could explain all these tanks that were driving around Donbass. And that's why they hired me. But saying that, I'm not a Middle Eastern specialist as such, you will get noticed then when I try to avoid pronouncing city names, because although I can read the letters, I have no ideas how to pronounce Arabic names, and I will probably be quite embarrassing in that. And I usually focus on the European conflicts on this, but because Austria also had some relations with Russia, the Russian angle was never lost, and especially the Russian military angle and its military modernization, because the reform, the restructuring, the doctrinal change in the Russian military that happened in 2007 was quite profound and for a long time lost in the West. And of course, the Middle East has had some part to play here. I mean, Syria was one of the primary playing grounds for Russia to test not only weapon systems, but also tactics, procedures, command and control structures that later on made it in Russian mainstream military forces. So before I start, I will try to grasp a bit what's the political objective, or where does Russia's Middle East policy in general come from, and where we started. And of course, much of it is like so many things in Russia, left over from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had intense political and military relations with Arab countries. the armed forces alone, for example, have trained over 50,000 military officers from Egypt, from Iraq, from Syria, from Algeria, and from Libya during the Cold War. These people sort of aren't lost. There is a file on each of them, and as armed forces and military structures are usually quite important for most Middle Eastern countries, these people made it further, even beyond the military, into politics and other administrative structures. So the Russians have actually quite good entry points in most of the local governments, if of course they hadn't been destroyed or turned over by an intervention since then, because they know a lot of people. They have a lot of access points. They also have, because of this time, they have sort of provided military advice, training, etc. for our countries. A lot of Arab-speaking specialists in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in, of course, the Foreign Intelligence Service and the Military Intelligence Service, which is still a leftover from Soviet times, but which is, of course, very useful if you want to conduct practical policies. And I have to say that, in a contrast to, for example, Ukraine, Middle Eastern policies usually is still run by specialists, or at least Putin listens to the specialists for advice on these matters. But for policies in the post-Soviet space, many Russians perceive, well, they speak Russian anyway, and they are part of the Soviet Union, so we know how they click and how the countries are run, and we don't have to listen to any specialists who gives us head up. We conduct the policies as we like, and usually the Russian policy in the post-Soviet space, hence, is, despite of the much greater use of assets and means and money, much less effective because it's much more unprofessional. But yeah, that's part of Putin's problem. Russian policy, foreign policy towards the Middle East was by and large also playing on divisions that were there in the region, and Russia sort of trying to be a mediator or trying to be an in-between player or a broker to elevate its own status, rested on the assumption that, first of all, there was a US dominance in the region that everybody hated, or most of the countries hated, and hence your normal tilt towards sort of your instincts in counterbalancing whatever the US does will give you a audience. And the second thing is, as sort of a lot of countries are de facto at war or in practical very deep confrontation, they don't talk to each other, so they are in a constant need of a third-party broker, which Russia can provide. And that basically, throughout the past 2 decades, was sort of the mainstream Russian Middle East policy. It is now getting a bit upturned because the US is withdrawing from the region, or the Biden administration is showing a kind of a indifference towards many sort of long-established US policy priorities, which then gives the Russians a hard time playing on the anti-American card, because if there is no tangible US policy, there's nothing to be against. And then sort of that puts Russia in the forefront to try to achieve settlements on their own with the Turks or with the Egyptians or with other parties, be it in Syria and Libya, without sort of having this focal point of an American angle you need to foil. And bringing such solutions or such peace deals to life on your own and with your own power is much more difficult than just counteracting your arch enemy. But for the time being, sort of they're not doing all too bad. Of course, one needs to sort of state that the primary interests of Russia in the region are limited, which gives Russia more freedom of action to pursue goals or change sides, whatever it likes. I mean, the primary economic interest is, of course, to stabilize oil prices. This became apparent in 2019 when Saudi Arabia tried to destroy the US as an exporting party by increasing the turnout, and sort of the Russians have been knocking on the Saudi door, like, please stop that, because they're living on a high oil price as well, or at least on a moderate oil price. And they have managed their relations with Saudi Arabia since. And of course, arms exports Middle East is the second most important theater to export military hardware to. 62% go to Asia, so India, China, Vietnam still the most important ones, but right after that, 26% of Russian arms exports go to the Middle East. And that provides quite a considerable bunch of foreign currency reserves for the Russian defense apparatus and the military industrial sector, which they need to advance their own domestic arms R&D programs. So it's not trivial, and Russia seeks to exploit political leverage and political prestige it gains through foreign policy to sort of advance this as well. The other sort of most prominent angle of Russian foreign policy, which is usually the domestic angle, sort of the equation, what does that mean for us? Does it mean a color revolution? Does it threaten our domestic rule? Is absent in the Middle East, because regardless which power does what, the chances that any of these developments might spill over into Russia and into Russian domestic affairs are quite remote. This is a contrast to the eastern neighborhood, where they are constantly afraid that Belarusian street protests or Ukrainian Maidan might spill over to them. The exception of this rule, of course, was 2011, the Arab Spring, and the fear that the Arab Spring might turn into something permanent, which it didn't. And that sort of, and especially then the Western intervention in Libya, a long-term Soviet client, and Gaddafi, sort of a friendly regime, that really sparked Russia's activities beyond sort of the usual diplomatic overtures. And the intervention into Syria was a reaction out of that. Sort of the basic instinct was, no, you don't dismantle our other client as well. The primary fear was that after 2014, the US ramping up their anti-ISIS fight, that the anti-ISIS fight might spill over into a toppling of Damascus, just as sort of the no-flight zone in Libya has spilled over into an anti-Gaddafi military campaign. And so by the end of September 2015, Russia officially intervened on behalf of the Assad regime, with relatively modest means at the beginning. So they had one squadron of Su-25 and one squadron of Su-24, conducting mainly strikes with old run-out Soviet dumb bombs. They also deployed some more modern fighters and elements of the Northern Fleet into the Mediterranean as a check to secure the base from any possible strike by either the US or any other regional power. Initially, the ground campaign rested on coordination with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which were instrumental at bringing the Russian in from the first place, and their local militias they equipped and organized as ground forces, and that went reasonably bad. The reliability and fighting powers of this militia was not very to the satisfaction of the Russians. And also they had particular problems gathering intelligence beyond the urgent front lines. So they were fighting and they were bombing, but they had not much idea sort of what was going on behind the rebel lines that were in front of their sight. And even when they started to use precision guided munitions and standoff munitions, they usually struck targets quite close and were not able to kind of run a deep interdiction campaign because they had weak intelligence on the enemy's rear. And as a consequence, the Russians tried to alter this by drastically increasing direct military advice. And by military advice, I don't mean a Russian officer that just looks over the shoulder of a Syrian officer and tells him what would be best, but basically by a Russian officer commanding Syrian forces on the ground. And in sort of the intensive areas of battles that basically was company level upwards, you were led by a Russian officer, sometimes even platoon level. Then they deployed Russian special operation forces to conduct or to take care of very key businesses, especially the air-to-ground coordination, sort of to guide the planes on where they should bomb, to coordinate artillery and ground forces, and increase the training and equipment for the Syrian armed forces. At the beginning, for all voluntary formations like the 25th Special Operations Division or the 5th Assault Corps, sorry for a cold, which were formed by all volunteers to kind of sideline the problems of discipline and motivation of normal conscript units. Later on, this went to sort of the training and equipment effort shifted towards also normal parts of the Syrian army, and an interesting development, and sort of that gives a bit of an insight in how deep the trust between Assad and Putin is. Once the training and equipping and Russian leadership sort of took over the 6th and 8th mechanized divisions and the brigade 116, Assad urgently formed the so-called 4th division, which is a huge conglomerate of various forces deployed around Damascus with absolutely no Russians inside, as a kind of backup security force to guard his personal power, regardless whatever the Russians were doing. The Russians also started to regularly deploy electronic intelligence aircraft and especially drones of various sizes, from very small ones up to the Orlan 10 and Forepost, which is a copy of the IAA Searcher drone, to gather more intelligence into the rear of the enemy. And they particularly emphasized their new computerized command and control structures. They also introduced into this theater, they started introducing sort of computerized command and control hardware in Russia in 2013. And in Syria, they were very pleased with the result of that. They also deployed private military companies to guard local economic infrastructure that companies of Russian companies ran in the oil sector, particularly because trust in local militias and the Iranians and the Syrians is not very high. They also have special militias that guard their base in Tartus and Latakia, especially Latakia airport. And both of them were, due to the war, expanded. So Tartus naval base will be upgraded to host again a Mediterranean flotilla. It will become a port that will host a floating dock to repair even larger warships. Although the floating dock isn't there yet, and I don't know the dimensions that it will have, because they had in the past quite problems to permanently or for longer shuttle deploy larger warships from the Northern Fleet. They had to refuel in Spanish ports, which cost them diplomatic brownie points. And the Spanish debate, they had issues. They always had to accompany them with high sea tugs, because if they have a mechanical failure, the distance towards the next Russian proper repair base was very long. So Tartus this is why they upgraded Tartus. And the airbase in Latakia also was very largely expanded, including barracks, including warehouses where they store a lot of their hardware and equipment. It has now runways that are long enough to host even mid-range bombers like the Tu-22. Although this bomber is not permanently deployed to Syria, it was deployed there for training and exercise, and they're able to host them there. The base also is heavily defended by air defense and electronic warfare assets. You have one battery of S-400, and you have at least one battery of S-300, and then you have smaller Tor and fancier short-range air defense systems, properly networked. I have to say, unlike, for example, the same systems operated by the Syrian Arab army, proper networked and coordinated with electronic warfare assets. So it's not so easy to pick them up individually as you can do with isolated air defense systems. This sort of the Syrian angle still is sort of the centerpiece of Russia's military presence in the region, and most of the other moves Russia made militarily usually concentrate around Syria. So the military campaign, of course, it concentrated on keeping Assad in power, which means first it struck against those opposition parties that were supported by Turkey and that were particularly supported by the United States. Basically, the design of the early stages of the campaign up to 2017 was to raise any sort of more or less moderate opposition in order to portray the whole war as you either support ISIS or you support us. It worked out quite well in the southwestern part, and in the western part of Syria, of course, the Kurds were always a opposition party that was not radical Islamist and that was not the Syrian regime, but the Kurds were more or less served to them by Donald Trump in 2019 when they pulled out, and Turkey's involvement gave them the sort of the comfortable position to squeeze the Kurds. If they want to squeeze the Kurds, they can serve them to the Turks, and that is a pressure point they can always use to enforce compliance and allow the Assad troops to deploy to eastern regions as well that were previously held by Kurdish militias. The big stumbling block for the Russians, of course, is still Idlib province and the M4 highway, which connects the western ports to central Syria, which is still held by Turkish-backed rebels, Islamist rebels, and Turkish deployed forces. And to force or to try to lure Turkey to withdraw from that area, they had an agreement from last year, but it wasn't really properly implemented, is sort of part of the campaign now. This is why they fly strikes against this area. But they are carefully waiting sort of to increase pressure on Turkey, but not to go into full confrontation with Turkey on the other hand, because they know that Turkey, being a direct neighbor, can deploy much more forces in a very quick amount of time. Plus, it might complicate their situation in eastern Syria if they lose Turkey as a pressure point against the Kurds. So this is what they're balancing now, and what the current campaign roughly is about. And this is also where Libya comes in. The Russian military deployments or perceived Russian military deployments into Libya rose into considerable prominence in 2019. Interestingly, the Libyan campaign from the Russian point of view is not that much of a priority. It basically came about with Russia reestablishing close ties with Egypt after the military coup of Sisi, and the Americans basically withdrawing some of their support for the Egyptian military. And the Egyptians are very much behind Haftar, the main driving and organizing force behind Haftar, and via the coordination with the Egyptians, basically the contact to Haftar came about. And then in 2019, of course, Turkey was intervening on behalf of the national government, the recognized government, which is more Muslim Brotherhood dominated, and hence Turkey, Erdogan was in favor of going for them, and Russia thought this is a proper. We have tried to pressure Turkey on Idlib for so many years, and Turkey doesn't give in. But if we really annoy them in Libya, maybe we'll get an angle to move Erdogan in Syria, and that was the prime motivation behind going deeper into Libya. Although the Russian military role is much more restricted. So they conduct the military advice operations by the Russian military intelligence service, but on a much higher level, not like in Syria, where you have this you have Russian military advisors at every level. There's no direct combat deployment there, as opposed to Syria, where in Syria the peak number of Russian military ground forces that were deployed was estimated at roughly 13,000 men in 2018. It's much lower now, but it was quite high. And there Russian forces took direct combat duties. They fought the hard battles that desperately needed to be won. This is not the case in Libya. It's not that much of a priority. They train Haftar's Air Force, of course. They maintain the airplanes. And certain combat and base protection duties are taken care of by private military companies who operate there basically on a basis of you allow Russian oil companies to come into Libya, and they will pay for protection of their assets, and the mercenaries paid there for the protection of the assets. They also may take one or the other combat duties if you need them, because we have a general interest in you maintaining your power there. That is sort of the Syrian, the Libyan angle. Also, the deployment of private military company personnel is much lower than in Syria. In Syria, we estimate this up to 2,000, so 1,500 to 2,000 personnel. In Libya, the estimations go roughly like 400 Wagner personnel, so a much lower presence. And unlike Syria, where Russia has made a firm bet on one side, in Libya, actually through some Chechen officers and liaison personnel, Russia keeps also an open dialogue to the recognized government, and they negotiate between both. They know both sides, and hence Libya is much more a tactical game. You know, you do this to gain a leverage on the Turks. If the leverage or the need for the leverage may disappear, Russia might also wind down the operations in Libya. Now, the other countries Russia has military relations, of course, are Egypt and Algeria, where the use of Russian military equipment still stemming from the Cold War and the necessity to modernize this is sort of keeping relations up. Also, Algeria arms sales are quite considerable. Plus, since the Russian army, they had a bad reputation after the first Gulf War for being a quite badly organized army, and that like Saddam Hussein's army that was organized, trained, led as a mini image of the Soviet army. This was it was not a prestige win for Russia or for the Soviet Union in the Middle East. Now, after, of course, Syria and after Ukraine, Egypt and Algeria became aware that, oops, they have reformed their armed forces. They have introduced new procedures, new leadership structures, new tactics that are actually effective, because look, they fight properly. Now, as we had taken in a lot of Soviet advice and have organizational cultures in our armed forces that are of course different, but not too different from the Soviets, we actually might look at their military reform and learn from there, because we, for monetary reasons, can't imitate the Americans in their way of warfare, or the Israelis, who are also effective, but introducing all this high-tech stuff is much more costly. So let's go for the Russian way of fighting. And so there's a renewed interest in both countries in learning on Russian military academies and high schools, and emulate the Russian military reform and have a look into the lessons learned. The other ally or clandestine ally not only politically but also militarily, of course, is Iran. And sorry, Russian-Iranian relations are much thicker than Russia wants to portray them. There is also, and that is sort of a particularity of Putin's Russia, there was a very close link, understanding, friendship between Soleimani, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commander that the Americans killed in Baghdad, and the Russian military intelligence service. They were thick, and the Russian military intelligence service has a straight line to Putin. So despite this being a very informal contact, it was a very straightforward contact and a very close one. As opposed to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is much more outside of the command loop in Russia. They're much more marginal than they used to be in Soviet times. And they coordinated, at least in the time when Soleimani was still alive, their coordination in Syria was much better than it is now. We also saw some Russian GRU personnel appearing in Yemen, alongside Iranian-backed militias, which was quite a curious thing. I still haven't found out what they actually did there, whether this was an operation to kind of recover Saudi weaponry, or they did more deeper military advice and training stuff, or maybe they did both. But it was quite interesting to see that. And of course, you have a technical and military industrial cooperation. If you look into the arsenal of weapons that are supposedly produced by Iran, you see a huge array of completely different kind of weapon systems that have no related, or most of them have no related research and development path or no evolutionary path. They just pop up, and here we have this thing, and it's produced by Iran, which makes me usually quite skeptical whether this is really produced by Iran or not, and if the physical dimensions of this thing are then exactly the same as a Russian weapon, and the electronic emissions and the characteristics of the weapon systems when in use is exactly the same as a Russian system. I suspect it's a Russian system, and it's just freshly painted over in Iran and then sold as an Iranian weapon system. And that applies to a lot of stuff, not only the ballistic missiles, the Shahab 1, 2, and the Shahab 3 being former Soviet liquid-fueled ballistic missiles, also the Ka-55 cruise missile made it into Iran and North Korea under very different names. The Buk M1 is called Rad. If it's Iranian painted over, this is the thing that shot down the Global Hawk, the American drone over the Gulf. The S-300 in their first iterations is called Bawa 373 if it's painted over in Iran, and the Buk M2, I can't spell out this strange name, but it's also found in Iran, and it's supposedly produced there. So a lot of, especially ballistic missiles and air defense missiles, are of Russian origin. Now you might say, well, the Iranians have so-called Iranian produced painted over Hawk and Kotal and whatever systems still stemming from the Shah time. But the interesting thing is, and supposedly they produce them now as a copy, which they don't. They usually don't fire them; they only parade them, which gives you a clue that the stockpile of these weapons is rather limited. And if you don't have an access to a new supply line of Hawk missiles, you don't use them for practice shooting. The Russian stuff they use for practice shooting and for real engagements, which gives us an idea that they're not worried about the supply line. And this is also a Russian tactic that also with regard to the nuclear program comes up. All these weapon systems were delivered when Russia formally adhered the weapons embargo against Iran. And it's basically an old tactic. You have a formal relation that allows you to sell this kind of stuff. And once sanctions go in the way, you kind of portray yourself to Europeans and the Americans that you're cooperating with them and want, of course, a return for their cooperation. And at the same time, you talk to your North Korean friends, well, can we proliferate this stuff and sell this stuff via your channels? And you take the diplomatic blame for us and we deliver the thing. And that is going on with Iran roughly since 1.5 decades now. I've been speaking here out of Berlin. They're still clever enough to fool the Germans and most of the Europeans with that. But it's to the sort of military experts, tank counters. It's quite clear where the things come from, and we'll see how their cooperation now with regard to Afghanistan further evolves, because here sort of Russia and Iran again on the same side of the table when it comes to the Taliban, and we'll see. The last country I need to mention, yes, in Sudan, Russia in 2019 struck a contract to erect a seaport in Port Sudan, a military naval base, but it fell silent on the construction of the base. The details do not seem to be clear, and the financing does not seem to be clear. And it might also, I mean, from a Russian military perspective, with the Suez Channel being still a bit in the way, it is an odd base, and the primarily interest in Russia in Syria to preserve the Assad regime, to insert itself as a responsible ally that keeps up to his strongman, this point was taken. And there is not, unlike the Cold War, there is not a direct military need to have a presence in the Indian Ocean and to underline any sort of interest in the Indian Ocean with military power. So I guess, I mean, the Russians had also negotiated with several African countries to erect a naval base in West Africa in the mid-2000s, basically to pressure the French. And it went nowhere for the same reason, that at the end, if you look at the cost, what such a base would cost and what your practical benefits are, you better take the money and go to Tartus and enlarge this base. So with that, this would be my introductory remarks, basically lining out in where we are with the Russians. I guess you have a lot of questions. And I'm happy to jump into the debate.
Thank you, Gustav, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. This is an amazing opportunity to hear your insights on such an interesting topic. We would now like to move on to the Q&A section of the event. If you wish to ask Mr. Gustav a question, please do so by using the raise hand function on your screen. If you are unsure how to use it, please send us a message via the chat and we will guide you. When given the time to speak, unmute yourself and start by providing your name and country. Okay, we received the first question. Mr. Gustav, how do you see the cooperation between Iran and Russia in the Middle East regarding the race toward nuclear weapon?
So, first of all, I mean, Iran going nuclear is not something that the Russians would desperately want, but it's also something that for them would not mean the end of the world. They have come to live with a lot of other nuclear powers, and they would rather see a nuclear Iran than having a a war situation, or to see Iran going down the faith of Iraq with the Americans, which I think by now is a fairly remote chance, because the Americans don't have much appetite for another big war in the Middle East. But at times this rationale was there. There was some cooperation between, or some clandestine cooperation between Russian nuclear energy companies and Iran in the late 90s and early 2000s. But I would not overestimate it. The Iranian nuclear enrichment technology has a different strand of sort of technological linearity compared to the Russian one. It's sort of a different type of centrifuge. It's a different type of how you organize a nuclear program. So some contacts are there, but they're not too deep. Now, with the race, the general race to nuclear weapons, and sort of whether they would want the Saudis and the Turks to have nukes as well. Also, this is something that the Russians don't like in particularly, but it's also something that they would regard as much lesser evil than the rest of the world, or the West in particularly. It would make sort of on the downside, of course, it would cause some concerns regarding further proliferation, regarding the regime stability and sort of nuclear weapons. Should one of these states fall apart, especially in the post-war period. But on the other hand, it would make them more geopolitically self-sufficient, which would diminish the need for US support and direct US military presence, which would, of course, give openings to Russia. The second thing is these subsystems of nuclear deterrence would work amongst themselves. So the Saudis would develop nukes to deter the Iranians would develop nukes to secure their position in their mind, deter their neighborhood and the Americans. So they don't see this proliferation as something that erodes their security. It erodes their status as a nuclear power, because the more nuclear powers there are, the less prominent the status of a nuclear power becomes, which is why they don't particularly like it. But there are also, I mean, during the Iran negotiations, the biggest service that the Russians did to the E3 was not to get in the way. They didn't really put a diplomatic effort to bring the Iran nuclear deal about. They heavily protested when Trump left it for the usual reasons that they could sort of, Trump's move was highly unpopular with almost the entire rest of the world. And so Russia, of course, used the opportunity to become an advocate of all of them. But on the other hand, they didn't do much effort to reconstruct the deal. So they're relaxed about it.
Thank you. We have a question from Binav. Binav, if you're there, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Binav Abdurrahman. I'm a student from the American University of Kurdistan, which is located in Iraq. So regarding of my questions, I have two actually. So for the first one, how Russia is capable to cover the security gap in Middle East, especially in Syria? And the other question is, what is the type of Russian-Kurdish relation, and how Russian can work with Kurds in order to have like independence, maybe in future, in next future? And thank you for having us today.
Thanks a lot. So in Syria, I mean, Russia's position rests on local proxies and militias and Russia's ability to play them. So there were times during the Syrian civil war when Russia and sort of Putin and Assad were really on no good terms. Assad being enormously skeptical or suspicious about Russia taking over the country and being too dependent. Putin thinking Assad is not thankful because he basically saved him and that he should be more forthcoming. There's enormous frustration in the Russian military about the corruption, bad behavior, lack of discipline of large parts of the Syrian armed forces, as well as the selfishness of the Iranian militias who do their own game, an own power game, and do not sort of fit themselves into any kind of arrangement or balance. But Russia is used to managing messes, much more used than the Americans. And for now, they kind of managed. I mean, even though it's painful and sort of post 2019, the relationship with Iranian militias went bad. Before that, they were useful in putting pressure on Assad. Now, relations with Assad are better, but with Iranians are a bit worse. So it's always a balancing game. Now, the Kurds, with the Syrian Kurds, with the Iraqi Kurds, there were relationships during the Cold War with regard to Turkey. Russia supported the PKK in Turkey as a counterforce against a NATO member, and of course, both Syria and Iraq were hideouts for conducting operations there. However, the Kurds changing sides, or the Kurds embracing the American invasion in Iraq and becoming quite a predominant pro-actor let these relationships slip for some time. Now, after 2019, after Trump abandoned them, the Kurds in Syria do not have any other chance but to turn to the Russians, because turning to the Turks is not an option. Turkey is hardline on them, and they know that sort of getting under Turkish rule would mean destruction. And if you see how the militias that Turkey organized and armed behave towards Kurdish civilian population, this would basically mean eradication. So they have no other chance but to seek a balance with Assad via the Russians, which is their primary line of communication, that preserves as much independence as they can get and run away with, but at the same time provide reassurance against Turkey. The Russians here are more forthcoming towards the Kurds because they think they are an able combat force. They're experienced, they're fought against ISIS. The Russians don't want to fight them themselves, and the Russians, the more parties you can preserve in the game that are combat capable, the easier it is for you as the kind of balancer and manager to play them against each other and to preserve an equilibrium. Assad is much more, no, it's my country, I want to be in power, and who are you? So this is sort of the state of affairs they're trying to manage. Whether they will come to a status quo they can live with, I don't particularly know. Guessing on the American unlust to go deeper into the Middle East, I think they will probably have to adapt to any kind of proposals the Russians will put in front of them, because there is no big alternative. There's no one else to turn to. If the Americans go out, who else there be? So they are quite in a bad situation.
Thank you. We have another question from John. When you want to ask your question, feel free.
Of course. I have 3 questions in one. First, I don't know if it's verified, but I heard that the Syrian, that the Syrian civil war was caused by the refusal of Assad to let a gasoline from Qatar to Germany to Europe run through Syria, because so that Russia could have a better leverage on Germany, and that Germany would remain neutral as a global player. So I would like to know your opinion on this. Secondly, it's difficult for me to understand. So I know that Russia is seeking to have leverage on many Middle Eastern countries, but I don't understand in what goal. And yeah, what are they seeking from that leverage? From putting pressure on the Turks, on the French, maybe, and playing each other and trying to be the manager of the region. Is there an ultimate goal, or is this just to be the region's manager? And now with the anticipated withdrawal of the Americans, how do you think the dynamics will evolve?
Thanks a lot. So the first one is easier to answer. Yes, this pipeline story came up in Moscow. It's I don't recollect the exact debate, but I think that's an ex post excuse. Putin was frightened in 2011 that the Arab Spring would mean something bigger. That sort of, especially he thought in his mind that this was organized by the CIA. In his mind, the Americans simultaneously across the entire Middle East, even against formal allies, started to stage revolutionary movements. And if they are so well prepared to do this at the same time, at this huge, in such a variety of states, they must have large sums of dark money and dark operatives and CIA clerks that run around. And if these people come to Moscow, then we are in trouble. So this is Putin's mindset. So he was really scared in 2011 that this is something bigger. And then came Libya and the dismantlement of Gaddafi, and Russia has abstained in the United Nations, and the United Nations vote was a substantial sort of power Russia had, and Russia also communicated this over a long time to several of its allies that, you know, nothing will happen to you because we will block any actions in the UN. And they said so to Saddam Hussein, for example, and the Americans went along anyway, which made them particularly furious. And this time, sort of the French and the British basically very liberally interpreted their mandate and went along. And Russia was again sort of, how does this fall back on Russia's power to be recognized as a blocking partner, as somebody who can counteract the Americans, and that sort of our allies from Venezuela to North Korea to Belarus rely on our blocking power, that, you know, we will stop the West if necessary. We will stop them. So this was the second thing. The third thing is, of course, that the very close relation of the Russian Orthodox Church with the Syrian Copts, the Egyptian Copts as well, but the Syrian Copts especially, and the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia is an instrument of power. It's an instrument to keep especially the older generations of voters and Russians aligned to the regime. And the Russian Orthodox Church was enormously nervous by the rise of Islamist opposition in Syria, and thought the regime is the only way to kind of keep this in check. And there was a demand for Russian action. the basically wiping out of Middle Eastern Christianity in Iraq was something that was not very well regarded in Moscow, and that they were very bitter about the Americans tolerating this. And so there was a domestic pressure not to let this being repeated. Nevertheless, they were unsure about how far the West would go on this. I mean, Clinton and Erdogan had joint press statements that Assad is a thing of the past and will look towards a post-Assad government. So they actually already announced regime change before they could make it happen. And the Americans, sort of this big mouthy American rhetoric, make the Russians first wait. So, okay, what is going to come? Do we enter war with the Americans there, or do we have a chance in managing this at a lower pace? And that basically came 2013 and the chemical affairs thing, where the Americans did not enforce their red lines. The Russians saw, okay, they're not too serious about this. There's not going to be another Libya. And their anti-ISIS campaign, although we fear this might escalate into a anti-governmental effort, it's not yet there. So we either intervene now, or we basically watch Assad fall. So we have to go now. And that's why they went. They had a sense that the West was not willing to confront them if they went, which they were right. And I had a sense that now or never, do something about it or completely leave it, which would mean domestic and international prestige loss for Russia. And yeah, later on, the pipeline thing was more or less something to ex post legitimize that. I don't even you know, if Assad would be toppled like Gaddafi, Syria today would probably look like Libya today. And can you build pipelines in Libya? I very much doubt. So the same goes for northern Iraq. You know, all these pipeline projects that run north are, I mean, where are they? They won't come, neither through Syria nor through Iraq. You could go from the Gulf, you could go to Kuwait, Iraq, up to Turkey, if that were a stable region where it would be worth building a pipeline, but it isn't. So what is the ultimate purpose of Russia being a broker and being a blocker? I mean, the big ultimate purpose is being a great power. That is what Russia's identity is about. It is a great power. The reason for the state to exist is to be a great power, and a nuclear one. And so you have to provide reason for your existence. Then, of course, there are practical issues. So for pressuring Turkey, this is primarily, of course, about Syria. Idlib, still unresolved from the Russian point of view, and you want to pressure Erdogan into concession. On the other hand, Turkey was very interested in Erdogan going this kind of neo-Ottoman, do it alone. We are not part of the West anymore. We don't care about what the Americans say, independent foreign policy. Russia falls in love with all of these movements, be it Nehru in India, be it now Erdogan. Sort of splitting countries away from the West is something that is a good thing in itself. And Erdogan and Putin share the same outlook on world policy and international order. So to get sort of Turkish-Russian relations running and sort of showing the rest of the world that we too can solve problems together, and although we are antagonists, we can manage our conflicts, is something that is worth for Russia, not only in practical terms to resolve Syria, but also in sort of abstract terms to show the West that it's not needed, and that sort of the future belongs to the regional powers, independent regional powers like Russia, like Turkey, like Iran, etc. And of course, then if you want to solve something with Russia, with Turkey, also in a Russian way, you need to have leverage on the other party. If you don't have leverage on the other party, you cannot enter into proper negotiation process. So this kind of creating leverage is a natural instinct of Russian policymaking. The same goes then to Europe. I mean, why to pressure the French? Because Russia is deeply, deeply, deeply unhappy with the European order, both in terms of territory as well as in terms of the order of power and its mechanisms. It wants to fundamentally revise the entire European order, but the Europeans don't want to. So if the Europeans don't want to, you have to pressure them into wanting this. And into concede that it's better to kind of give in to Russian wishes than to resist and stubbornly insist on your European democratic blah, blah, blah. And this is why you need to create leverage on the French. This is why, of course, Russia was all but unhappy if millions of Syrians make their way to Europe, because it's a pressure point. This is why they reactivated their contacts to Gaddafi's former secret police, which was run by certain tribes in southwest Libya that now organize the smuggling rings of African migrants into Europe. Because it's a pressure point. If you can annoy the Italians and pressure the Italians and the French by ramping up migrants, well, let's do so. The same he does in Belarus. This is classical Russian tactical behavior. If you want something from the other party, find the point where it's vulnerable, stick your finger into it, turn it around, and see how the other party is behaving.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gustav, we would like to thank you for coming and speaking today. It was an honor hearing your personal insight and sharing with us your knowledge. The event is now officially over. Before we close the event, we would like everyone to open their cameras so we can take a group picture. Also, we would like to thank you all for joining us today in another outstanding event. So whenever it's possible, everybody open the pictures. We would like to see your smiles. Take a group picture. And we hope to see you in one of our future events. Also, if you are not yet an IDI member, feel free to follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, in order to stay up to date with IDI's activity throughout the academic year. So we will now take the picture.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. The event is now officially over. Mr. Gustav, again, it was a huge honor to hear from you. It was an amazing event. Thank you.
Thank you very much for hosting me. I hope I could give you something you don't yet know. I guess you're all better experts on the Middle East than I am. So it was really a pleasure. And good questions.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.